Hello, and welcome back. If you're here, I'm glad you found your way to this quiet corner of the night. Maybe you've already turned off most of the lights, or maybe there's still one small lamp glowing softly somewhere nearby. Maybe you're lying in bed, or settled into your favorite chair, wrapped in something warm. Wherever you are right now, I want you to know that this is a safe place. A slow place. A place where nothing needs to rush, and nothing needs to be solved tonight. I'm going to tell you a story. A true one. My own. It's not a story with loud moments or sharp turns. It's the kind of story that moves the way a quiet river moves. Steadily, gently, carrying you along without any effort on your part. It's a story about being poor and being proud. About being hungry and being determined. About a small act of kindness that changed the entire shape of my life, though I didn't know it at the time. And it's about what it means to finally become the person you always quietly believed you could be, even when no one else seemed to believe it alongside you. So take a slow breath in. Let it go. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you're resting. And let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Daniel. And for a long time, that name felt like the only thing I truly owned. I grew up in a small town in central Ohio. One of those towns that's easy to miss if you're driving through. The kind that doesn't have a famous restaurant or a historical landmark, or anything that makes people pull off the highway and look around. It had a grain elevator at the edge of town that rose up taller than everything else, and a dollar store on Main Street, and a gas station that also sold bait, and a diner called Martha's, where the booths were always slightly sticky, no matter how much they wiped them down. I say all of this not to make it sound sad, because it wasn't. Not entirely. It was just small and quiet. And when you grow up somewhere small and quiet, you either learn to love the smallness, or you spend your whole childhood looking at the horizon. I was a horizon looker. My mother raised me and my younger sister Becca in a rented house on Elm Street, though I always thought calling it Elm Street was a bit generous, because the elms had all been cut down years before we moved in, and it was really just a cracked sidewalk, with a few struggling maples and some dandelions, that came back every spring without being asked. The house was old. It had a furnace that clicked and groaned all through the winter nights, and a kitchen faucet that dripped unless you turned it off with both hands and leaned into it, and a back porch where the boards were soft in places, and you had to remember where to step so your foot didn't go through. But it was ours, in the way that a rented place can feel like yours when you've lived there long enough to know all its secrets. My mother worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood. She cleaned rooms at a motel on Route 40 during the day, and 3 evenings a week, she waited tables at a bar on the edge of town called the Rusty Nail. She came home on those evenings, smelling of cigarette smoke and fryer grease, and she was always tired in a way that settled deep in her eyes. But she always asked how Becca and I had done with our homework, and she always found a way to be present, even when her body was barely holding itself upright. I loved her for that. I still do. My father had left when I was 7. I don't carry a lot of anger about it anymore. I did for a long time. But somewhere along the way, I let most of it go, because holding it was heavy, and I needed my hands free for other things. He sent a card sometimes. At Christmas, usually. Occasionally on my birthday, though often a week late. He was somewhere in Pennsylvania. I knew that much. But Pennsylvania might as well have been the moon, for how much it touched our daily lives. So it was the 3 of us. Mum, Becca and me. And we were careful with money the way you learn to be. Careful when there isn't enough of it. We ate a lot of pasta. We bought store-brand cereal and powdered milk and whatever was on sale. We got our winter coats from the church thrift sale every October. I wore the same pair of sneakers from 7th grade until halfway through 9th, until the soles started separating from the upper and I had to walk carefully in the rain. to keep my socks from getting soaked. My mother cried quietly in the kitchen one night, not knowing I was awake, and the next day there was a new pair of sneakers at the foot of my bed. I never asked how she managed it. I just wore them, and tried to take better care of them than I had the last pair. I tell you all of this not to draw pity, because I've never wanted pity for any of it. I tell you because it's the ground the rest of the story grows from, and you can't understand the flower without understanding the soil. What I had, in all that smallness and quietness and careful money counting, was a mind that liked to understand things. I liked to know how things worked. When the furnace groaned and clicked, I wanted to know why. When I got a cold, I wanted to understand what was actually happening inside. My body that made my throat hurt and my nose run. In school, my favorite thing was biology. Not just because the diagrams were interesting, though they were, but because there was something almost comforting about the idea that all of life followed rules. That there was order underneath the chaos. That if you learned enough, you could begin to make sense of things. My biology teacher in 9th grade was a woman named Mrs. Hartwell. She was somewhere in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair she wore in a bun and reading glasses she was always misplacing. She was not a flashy teacher. She didn't have big theatrical moments or clever catchphrases. She just taught steadily and carefully, and she paid attention to her students in a quiet, unhurried way. One afternoon in October, she kept me after class. I stood there nervously, my backpack over one shoulder, wondering if I'd done something wrong. She looked at me over her glasses and said, "Daniel, have you ever thought about becoming a doctor?" I blinked at her. I genuinely didn't know what to say. The idea felt enormous. It felt like something that happened to other people. People whose fathers lived at home and whose mothers didn't come home, smelling like cigarette smoke, and whose winter coats hadn't come from a church sale. "I don't know," I said, which was the most honest answer I had. She nodded slowly, as if that answer made perfect sense to her. "You should think about it," she said simply. And then she handed back my biology test, which I had gotten 102 on, because of the bonus question, and she sent me on my way. I walked home that afternoon through a thin October drizzle, my sneakers damp at the toes, and I turned that question over in my mind the whole way. "Have you ever thought about becoming a doctor?" I hadn't, not seriously, not as a real thing. But that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner while Becca did her homework across from me and my mother's second job carried her away into the night, I opened my notebook and I wrote the word down. Doctor. I sat there looking at it for a long time. Then I wrote underneath it, "Why not?" The years that followed were not easy, but they were purposeful, and I think purpose makes even the hard things bearable. I studied with the kind of focus that comes when you don't have a lot of fallback options. I didn't go to parties much. I didn't have a car. I had a library card and a bicycle with a slightly bent front wheel that made a soft, clicking sound with every rotation, and I used both of them constantly. I volunteered at the county hospital during the summers, not in any glamorous capacity, just answering phones and wheeling patients to their rooms and delivering flowers to the right rooms, and once, memorably, helping a very elderly man named Harold find his teeth, which had rolled under his bed during a nap. But I was there. I was watching and listening and absorbing the way the place worked, the way the doctors moved through the hallways, the way the nurses were usually the ones who actually knew what was happening with every patient. I graduated third in my class. I got a partial scholarship to a state university 2 hours away. The rest my mother and I cobbled together with loans and a small grant from a local organization that helped first-generation college students. The night before I left, my mother made spaghetti with meat sauce, her special version that she only made for birthdays and big occasions, and we sat at that kitchen table with the wobbly leg, the three of us, and we talked and laughed and didn't mention all the things we were trying not to feel. When I hugged her goodbye the next morning, she held on longer than usual. I could feel her breathing carefully, the way people do when they're trying not to cry. "Call me every Sunday," she said. Every Sunday, I promised. I kept that promise. Even through the hardest years, I kept it. College was its own kind of education, and I don't mean that only in the academic sense. I learned, for the first time in a real and immediate way, how different my background was from many of the people around me. Not everyone. There were other students who knew what it meant to count change carefully, who worked part-time jobs during the semester, who sent money home when they could. But there were also students who had never worried about the cost of a textbook, who went home for spring break to warm places, who talked casually about the cars their parents were going to buy them when they graduated. I didn't envy them, exactly. Or maybe I did a little, sometimes, in the evenings when the loneliness got big. But mostly I just kept my head down and did the work. I waited tables at an Italian restaurant near campus 3 nights a week. I ate a lot of peanut butter sandwiches. I bought my textbooks used when I could and took meticulous notes when I couldn't afford the book at all. My room in the dormitory was small and faced a parking lot, and in the winter the window let in a cold draft no matter how much. I stuffed the gap with folded paper towels. But I had a desk lamp and a quiet and a purpose. And that was enough. I graduated with honors, applied to medical school, got rejected from 4 schools in a row. I remember sitting in the computer lab reading the 4th rejection email, and the lab was very quiet because it was late, almost 11 at night, and most people had gone back to their dorms. The light overhead was that particular harsh fluorescent white that makes everything look a little clinical, and I sat there for a long time just looking at the screen. The email was politely worded. They wished me all the best in my future endeavors. Outside the window, snow was falling, very soft and slow, landing on the parking lot and dissolving almost immediately. I thought about Mrs. Hartwell. I thought about the word I'd written in my notebook. Doctor. I thought about Harold's teeth. I thought about my mother at Martha's Diner, and the church thrift coats, and the bent wheel on my bicycle clicking softly all those miles. And then I closed the laptop and walked back through the snow to my dormitory, and I went to bed, and the next morning I got up and started working on my 5th application. I got in on my 5th try. The school was in a different state, Tennessee, which felt as foreign to me then as another country. I drove there in a borrowed car with everything I owned in the back seat, which wasn't very much. Clothes, books, a lamp, a photograph of my mother and Becca at the state fair, and a small cactus that Becca had given me as a going-away gift, telling me seriously that it was unkillable and that therefore I had no excuse. The cactus survived all 4 years of medical school. It sits on my windowsill now. Medical school was the hardest thing I have ever done. I say that plainly and without drama, because that's exactly what it was. It was long and relentless, and it demanded everything, and sometimes it felt like it was specifically designed to find the thing inside you that was breakable and then press on it steadily until something gave. The volume of information was overwhelming. The hours were brutal. There were days I went over 30 hours without real sleep. There were nights I sat on the bathroom floor of my little apartment. I had a studio apartment by then, shared a wall with a couple who argued frequently and seemed to make up just as frequently, and I wasn't sure if what I was feeling was exhaustion or despair, or just the particular heaviness that comes when you are pushing hard at the very edge of what you think you're capable of. The financial weight was constant. The scholarships I had covered some. The loans covered more. But there were always gaps, always small emergencies. A car repair, a dental visit, a month when the electric bill was higher than expected, and I became very good at the math of survival. I knew exactly how much was in my account at all times. I knew how long a bag of rice lasted. I knew which grocery store marked things down on Thursday evenings. I did not call my mother every Sunday and tell her any of this. I called her every Sunday and told her about my patients, about the things I was learning, about a professor who had said something funny, about the cactus, which continued to thrive while requiring nothing from me but a small amount of sunlight and patience. I gave her the good parts, because the good parts were real too, and she had enough to carry already. There was one semester, my second year, late in the fall, when things got particularly tight. I had miscalculated an expense, or perhaps underestimated one. I don't remember the exact details anymore, only the feeling of looking at my bank balance and understanding that I would need to choose carefully what I ate for the next 3 weeks. Not a crisis, I told myself. Just a difficult stretch. I had been through difficult stretches before. It was during this time that I met Dr. Ellison. Dr. Ellison was not someone I expected to know me. He was the attending physician on the internal medicine ward where I was doing my clinical rotation. A man in his late 60s, tall and slightly stooped with the kind of deliberate, unhurried manner that I would later come to understand was not slowness, but precision. He had a full head of white hair and a mustache that he'd clearly had for decades, and he wore bow ties. Always bow ties, even under his white coat, which I thought was wonderful. He had trained at a very good program and had stayed at our teaching hospital for almost his entire career, which told you something about his priorities. He could have been at a prestigious institution somewhere. He had chosen to stay here, where the patients were often poor and uninsured and complicated, where the work was harder than it needed to be, and the resources were always a little stretched. He was not demonstratively warm. He didn't put his arm around students and encourage them with big speeches, but he paid attention in a quiet way. He noticed things, and what I would come to understand, slowly, over the weeks of that rotation, was that noticing was actually the most important thing, in medicine and in everything else. He noticed me, not in a dramatic way. Nothing was said outright, but there were small signs, looking back. He would ask my opinion first, before the other students. Not to put me on the spot, but because he seemed genuinely curious about what I thought. He would pause sometimes after I'd answered a question and say, "Tell me more about that," and then actually listen, which felt rare. One Thursday evening in November, he asked me to stay after rounds. The ward had quieted down. The nurses were changing shift. The hallway smelled of whatever they'd served for dinner, something warm and starchy, maybe mashed potatoes, and the overhead lights had shifted into their evening mode, slightly dimmer, as if the hospital was acknowledging that the day was winding down. Dr. Ellison sat down across from me, in the small workroom off the nurse's station, and folded his hands on the table and looked at me. "How are you doing, Daniel?" he asked, and something in the way he said it, not the casual "how are you" that people say without expecting an answer, but the real version, the version that meant I actually want to know, made me hesitate before I gave my usual fine. I said, "Honestly, it's been a hard stretch." He nodded, as if that was what he'd expected. I told him some of it. Not all of it. I had too much pride for all of it. But some. The financial math that wasn't adding up. The way I sometimes sat in the library late at night, not because I needed to study more, but because it was warm there, and I was trying not to run up my electric bill. The particular brand of exhaustion that comes, not just from being tired, but from worrying, consistently, quietly, all the time, the way a low fever hums underneath everything. Dr. Ellison listened without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, looking at his folded hands. Then he looked back up at me. "I was a first-generation student," he said. "My father drove a truck. My mother worked in a textile mill. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for most of my college career, and I know exactly how many portions you can stretch a bag of rice into." He said this without performance, without drama. Just facts. I had a man who helped me when I needed it. I've been looking for the chance to do the same thing ever since. He reached into his white coat and produced an envelope. He set it on the table between us. He didn't push it toward me. He just left it there. "This is not a loan," he said. I want to be very clear about that, because I know what it means to a person's pride. This is something I'm giving freely, because you are going to be an excellent physician, and I would like to help you get there. The only thing I ask is that someday, when you have the means, you do something similar for someone else. I stared at the envelope. I felt something moving in my chest that I didn't have a name for. Not quite embarrassment. Not quite gratitude. Something more complicated than either of those. Something that had to do with years of quiet, determination and borrowed coats and bent bicycle wheels and my mother's face in the kitchen late at night, tired in a way that went all the way down. I picked up the envelope. Inside was a check. It was not a small amount. I looked up at him and I did not know what to say. My throat felt full. Dr. Ellison, I started. He shook his head very slightly. Get some sleep, he said. Round start at 6. He stood up, straightened his bow tie. A deep burgundy one that night, with small white dots, and walked out of the room. I sat there alone for a few minutes, holding the envelope, listening to the quiet sounds of the evening ward settling around me. The soft beeping of a monitor somewhere down the hall. The distant sound of a cart being wheeled. The heating system making its gentle background hum. Then I folded the envelope carefully and put it in my pocket, and I walked out into the cool November night, and I stood there for a moment looking up at the sky, which was clear and very dark and full of stars. And I breathed, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. The rest of medical school changed after that. I don't mean that it became easy. It didn't. The work remained hard. The hours remained brutal. The exhaustion was still a constant companion. But something shifted in me that November. Something subtle and important. The constant low-level worry, the hum of the fever, quieted enough that I could hear other things again. I could think more clearly. I could be more present with my patients, which is what matters most when you're learning to be a doctor. I thought about Dr. Ellison often as I worked. I watched how he moved through the ward. Carefully, attentively, never in a hurry even when things were busy. I watched how he spoke to patients, how he sat down when everyone else was standing, how he made eye contact in a way that said, "I have time for you," even when he didn't technically have time. I was learning medicine. Yes, but I was also learning something else. I was learning what it looked like to be good at something, and also good as a person. That those two things didn't have to be separate. I graduated from medical school on a warm May afternoon, and my mother and Becca drove down from Ohio for it. My mother cried, openly and without apology, and Becca photographed everything. We had dinner at a restaurant near campus. A real restaurant, not a fast food place. And I paid for it, which was the first time in my life I had paid for a proper dinner for the three of us. And I felt that in a way I can't fully articulate, a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the food. Dr. Ellison was at the graduation. I saw him afterward, standing near the edge of the lawn in a grey suit and, naturally, a bow tie, a celebratory yellow one that day. I walked over to him and shook his hand and thanked him. He looked at me for a moment with those quiet, steady eyes of his. "You did it," he said. "We did it," I said. He smiled at that. A real one, slow and genuine. And then he nodded once, as if something had been settled between us, and he moved on to congratulate someone else. I did my residency in internal medicine. 3 more years of long hours and steep, learning curves and the particular intimacy of being trusted with people's bodies and fears at some of the most difficult moments of their lives. I worked at a hospital that served a low-income community, which felt right to me in a way I could feel but couldn't always fully explain. I understood something about what it meant to wait a long time before seeing a doctor because you couldn't afford it. I understood something about coming in sicker than you needed to be because you'd been managing at home as long as you could. I brought that understanding with me into every room I walked into, thought about Mr. Harold and his teeth, about Mrs. Hartwell and her question, about my mother at the motel on Route 40, stripping sheets in the morning light. about a teenager on a bent bicycle, riding through October drizzle with a word written in a notebook. Doctor. I became a doctor. I say those words simply because they are simple, even though nothing about getting there was simple. I became a doctor. I am in my 40s now. I have my own practice. A small internal medicine clinic in a mid-sized city, not far from where I did my residency. We serve a mixed community. We see patients without insurance. We work with the local free clinic on certain days. We have a billing team that has been trained to ask gently, carefully, about what patients can actually afford, and we make arrangements. I am not a rich man, but I am comfortable, and I have worked hard to stay oriented to what that comfort is for. Dr. Ellison retired a few years ago. We exchange emails sometimes, real emails, the kind with more than 2 sentences, because we are both people who believe some things are worth saying at proper length. He is well. He tends a garden now and reads more than he used to, and occasionally does volunteer medicine at a clinic near where he lives. He sounds content in the emails. At peace. The kind of peace that comes from a life spent doing the right things. 2 years ago, I met a medical student named Alejandro. He was rotating through our clinic as part of his 3rd-year training, and I noticed him in the same quiet way that Dr. Ellison had once noticed me. He was careful with patients. He listened. He asked the kind of questions that told me he was thinking about the whole person, not just the presenting symptom. He was also clearly exhausted in the specific way of someone who is managing too many things simultaneously. The particular look around the eyes, the slight distraction in unguarded moments. One afternoon when the clinic had quieted, I asked him to sit with me in my office for a few minutes. I made him a cup of coffee, and I asked, as Dr. Ellison had once asked me, "How are you doing, Alejandro?" "Really?" he told me. 1st generation. Father in construction, mother in home healthcare. 4 siblings. A loan amount that made my chest tighten on his behalf. A part-time tutoring job he was doing on weekends to keep ahead of things, at a cost to his sleep and his focus that neither of us said out loud. I listened without interrupting. When he was done, I was quiet for a moment. Then I reached into my desk drawer and took out an envelope. I had been keeping it there for 2 years, waiting. I set it on the desk between us. "This is not a loan," I said. "I think about kindness sometimes, the way it travels, the way it doesn't just pass between 2 people, but keeps moving forward, looking for the next place it's needed." Dr. Ellison received something once. He told me that the man who helped him, and it traveled to me, and now it has traveled to Alejandro, and who knows where Alejandro will carry it when the time comes. There's something quietly beautiful in that. Something that doesn't need to be announced or celebrated, that just moves through the world like a river moving through a landscape, shaping things gently, persistently over time. I am not a sentimental person. Exactly. I am a doctor. I have been trained to be practical and precise. But I do believe in this particular thing. I have seen too much evidence of it to doubt it. Kindness is not finite. The more of it moves through the world, the more there is. And sometimes all it takes is one person. One Mrs. Hartwell asking a quiet question. One Dr. Ellison with an envelope and a burgundy bow tie. And the whole trajectory of a life turns, slowly and gently, in a different direction. My mother is retired now. She lives in a small house in a nicer part of town than the one I grew up in, and I help with what I can. She has a real furnace, one that doesn't click and groan. Her kitchen faucet doesn't drip. She has a back porch where the boards are solid and don't flex under her feet. She drinks her coffee there in the mornings, she tells me, and watches the birds. Becca is a physical therapist. She has 2 children, a boy and a girl, and she lives 20 minutes from our mother, and they see each other often. The photograph she took at my graduation is on her refrigerator still. She told me last Christmas. Me in my graduation gown, squinting into the sun, and our mother on one side and Becca on the other. both of them grinning so wide you can see it from across a room. I keep the cactus on my windowsill. I still call my mother every Sunday. And that, I think, is the story I wanted to tell you tonight. Not a story of triumph exactly, or at least not the loud kind. More like a quiet accumulation. Small things, one after another, over many years. A word written in a notebook. A borrowed car. A bent bicycle wheel. An envelope on a table. A cup of coffee and a real question and a door open for someone who needed it. I think that's mostly what a life is, really. Not the big dramatic moments, but the small true ones. The steadiness. The choosing, again and again, to keep going, to keep caring, to look for the person who needs what you once needed and to give it freely, without keeping score. I hope that wherever you are tonight, you are warm. I hope whatever carried you here today, whatever weight or worry or long week, is resting a little lighter on your chest now. I hope you can feel, as I do some evenings when I sit on my own porch and listen to the quiet, that the world is full of small kindnesses moving through it like water through stone, patient and invisible and persistent. You don't always see the river carving, but over time you see what it's made. Let your breathing slow now. Let your body feel heavy and at rest. Outside, wherever you are, the night is doing what night does, settling in, going quiet, holding everything gently in its dark. The sounds around you, if there are any, are just the world breathing. You don't need to attend to any of it. Just rest. You've done enough today. The story is over, and it ended the way good stories do. Not with everything resolved and perfect, but with things moving in the right direction, slowly and surely, the way rivers move, the way seasons turn, the way a cactus on a windowsill simply continues, without drama, to exist and even quietly to grow. Close your eyes, if they aren't already closed. Let sleep come the way it always does. Unhurried, uninvited, simply arriving when you finally let your guard down enough to let it in. Good night.